I thought Max was overreacting when he ended things without even letting me explain what happened at the party. How did one stupid joke turn into losing my relationship, my apartment, and half my friend group? I never imagined that proving I deserved more excitement would leave me with nothing but silence and an empty inbox where his name used to be. My name is Thalia Morvan, and I am 31 years old, working as a social media coordinator for a lifestyle brand that promotes travel, wellness, and living your best authentic life, which means I spend most of my day crafting captions about spontaneity and adventure for people who scroll through their phones looking for permission to be interesting. I have been dating Max Caldwell for 3 years, and while I love him in the way you love someone who is stable and reliable and kind, I have started to feel like our relationship has become predictable in a way that makes me restless, and I find myself craving the kind of excitement and validation that comes from pushing boundaries and proving that I am not the type of person who settles into boring routines just because that is what comfortable couples are supposed to do. Max is 33 and works as an IT systems analyst for a mid-sized tech firm, which means he spends his days solving problems with patient precision and creating order out of chaos. And while I used to find his calm demeanor attractive, lately it has started to feel like a weight that keeps me from being spontaneous and fun. And I have begun to think that maybe he is holding me back from the version of myself that I want to be. On a Friday evening in late September, I stood on the balcony of Max's apartment overlooking the parking lot below, where the streetlights were just starting to flicker on and the city felt alive in a way that made staying inside feel suffocating. And I leaned against the metal railing and told Max that I could not believe he wanted to stay in again when there were a dozen things we could be doing. And I half joked that his idea of excitement was watching documentaries about ancient civilizations and reorganizing his bookshelf by genre and publication date. Max was sitting on the balcony chair with his phone in his hand, checking something work-related, and he looked up at me with that patient expression he always has when I am trying to get a rise out of him. And he said calmly that he did not mind going out sometimes, but that he also valued having a home where we could relax without feeling like we always had to be performing or proving something to other people, and his tone was so measured and reasonable that it made me feel like the unreasonable one for wanting more than quiet Friday nights and predictable routines. I turned away from the railing and walked back inside to the living room, where the television was paused on the opening credits of some documentary he had queued up, and I sat down on the sofa and pulled out my phone to scroll through Instagram stories of friends at bars and parties and restaurants, and I made a comment about how we were starting to sound like an old married couple who had given up on having fun. And I could see Max's jaw tighten slightly, even though he did not say anything right away. When he finally did speak, he pointed out that we had gone out last weekend to Owen's barbecue, and the weekend before that to dinner with Bree, and he asked what specifically I wanted to do tonight if staying in was so unbearable, and his question was genuine rather than sarcastic. But I found it annoying because it forced me to admit that I did not actually have a plan. I just did not want to feel like we were wasting our youth on Netflix and early bedtimes. The conversation shifted uncomfortably after that, and I decided to drop it rather than escalate into an actual argument. But the tension stayed in the air between us, and later that evening when Max went to take a shower, I sat on the sofa scrolling through my phone and noticed a text from Garrett Flynn, who is Max's best friend from college and someone I have always gotten along with because he has the same kind of easygoing humour that I wish Max had more of. The next morning, I brought up something that had been on my mind for a few weeks, which was that I had made copies of Max's spare apartment key and given them to Owen and Garrett without asking Max first, because Owen had mentioned needing a place to drop off some equipment he was borrowing, and at the time it seemed like a practical and friendly thing to do, the kind of thing that people who are close and trust each other would do without making it into a big production. Max was sitting at the small dining table near the kitchen eating cereal and reading something on his tablet, and when I mentioned casually that I had given the spare keys to Owen and Garrett a few weeks ago, he looked up from his tablet with an expression I could not quite read, and he asked why I had not mentioned it before, or asked him if he was comfortable with that arrangement. I told him that I did not think it was a big deal because they were his closest friends, and we trusted them, and that asking permission for every little decision felt controlling and unnecessary. And I pointed out that I had been staying at his apartment so often that I practically lived there anyway. So why should I have to get approval for making copies of a key that I used regularly? Max put down his spoon and said that the issue was not whether he trusted Owen and Garrett, but rather that it was his apartment and his privacy, and that giving out access without discussing it with him first crossed a boundary that should have been obvious. I felt my defences rising because his framing made me sound thoughtless and disrespectful when I had only been trying to help, and I told him that he was being paranoid and possessive, and that normal people share keys with close friends all the time without turning it into a referendum on trust and control, and I suggested that his obsession with permission and boundaries was a sign that he did not trust my judgment or respect my independence. Max listened without interrupting, which is something he always does that makes me feel like he is cataloguing my words rather than actually hearing them. And when I finished speaking, he said quietly that he was not trying to control me or isolate me, but that he needed to feel secure in his own home, and that having people come and go without his knowledge made him uncomfortable regardless of who those people were. I told him that if he really loved me and trusted me, he would not make everything into a control issue. And I accused him of trying to change who I was by imposing all these rules and expectations that made me feel like I had to walk on eggshells just to avoid upsetting his need for order and predictability, and the conversation ended without any real resolution. And I could tell that Max was frustrated but trying to avoid escalating things into a full argument. Later that week, I met Bree Halloway for coffee at the outdoor seating area of a cafe near the marketing district where we both worked, and I spent most of the conversation venting about how Max had been acting cold and distant ever since our disagreement about the spare keys, and I told her that I was starting to feel suffocated by his need to control every aspect of his environment, and that I deserved to be with someone who trusted me enough to make simple decisions without requiring his explicit permission for everything. Bree listened with her usual supportive expression, but I noticed that she was not jumping in with the kind of enthusiastic validation I was hoping for. And when I asked her directly if she thought I was being unreasonable, she hesitated for a moment before saying that she could see both sides, but that maybe Max had a point about wanting to know who had access to his personal space. And her response frustrated me because I had expected her to take my side without question the way best friends are supposed to do. I told Bree that Max's behaviour was part of a larger pattern of him trying to make me feel guilty for being spontaneous and fun, and I mentioned that he had recently started questioning why I was spending time with Garrett during the day, as if having male friends was somehow inappropriate or suspicious, and I framed the situation as Max being jealous and insecure rather than having legitimate concerns about boundaries and transparency. Bree asked if there was something specific that had happened with Garrett that might have made Max uncomfortable, and I brushed off the question by saying that Garrett and I were just friends and that Max needed to work on his own insecurity issues instead of projecting them onto me. And I posted a vague status update on my social media about how exhausting it is to be with someone who does not understand that friendship is not the same as betrayal. And I felt validated when several people liked and commented in agreement. What I did not mention to Bree was that earlier that week, I had arranged to meet Garrett at the grocery store parking lot to give him some design files he needed for a freelance project, and that when we were standing by Max's car talking and laughing about something I could not even remember now, Nina Caldwell, who is Max's older sister and someone who has never fully warmed up to me, had pulled into the parking lot and seen us together. I had noticed Nina sitting in her car a few spaces away, and I had waved at her casually, but she had not waved back, and instead she had just watched us for a moment before getting out of her car and walking into the store without acknowledging either of us. And I had felt a small spike of anxiety, wondering if she would mention the encounter to Max, and if he would misinterpret what was clearly just a friendly meeting between two people who happened to run into each other while doing errands. That evening, when I returned to Max's apartment, he was sitting on the living room sofa with his laptop open. and the atmosphere between us felt strained in a way that made me defensive before he even said anything. And when he finally did speak, he mentioned that Nina had texted him, saying she had seen something concerning at the grocery store. And he asked me directly if I had been meeting Garrett earlier that day and why I had not mentioned it when I got home. I told Max that he was being ridiculous and that I did not report to him about every single person I bumped into during the day, and I accused him of having his sister spy on me, which was completely unfair and invasive, and I said that his jealousy was becoming a serious problem that he needed to address before it destroyed our relationship entirely. Max explained calmly that Nina was not spying on anyone. She had simply been at the same grocery store and happened to see us together, and he pointed out that the issue was not that I had been talking to Garrett, but rather that I had not mentioned the meeting when he asked how my day was, and that the pattern of small omissions was starting to make him wonder what else I was not telling him. I responded by saying that I should not have to provide a detailed account of every conversation and encounter just to satisfy his need for control, and that his fixation on tracking my movements and questioning my friendships showed a level of possessiveness that was unhealthy and concerning. And I told him that if he could not trust me to have normal social interactions without supervision, then maybe we were not compatible after all. The argument ended with both of us retreating to separate parts of the apartment, and I went into the bedroom and closed the door and immediately opened my phone to post another vague status about people who do not understand that trust means freedom and not constant surveillance. And I felt a rush of satisfaction when Garrett liked the post within minutes and left a supportive comment saying that some people just do not get it. Later that night, after Max had gone to bed without saying goodnight, I scrolled through my phone and saw that Nina had sent Max a text asking if everything was okay, and Max had replied saying he was handling it, and I felt a surge of anger that his sister was inserting herself into our relationship and influencing his perception of me, and I decided that the next time I saw Nina, I would make it clear that her opinions were not welcome and that her protective behavior toward her brother was crossing boundaries that were none of her concern. The following day, Max seemed quieter than usual, and I noticed that he had started keeping his phone face down on the table and that he checked it frequently with an expression I could not quite read. And when I asked him what he was working on, he said simply that he was organizing some files and updating passwords, and his vague response made me suspicious, but I did not press the issue because I did not want to seem like the controlling one after accusing him of exactly that behavior. Over the next few days, the distance between us grew more pronounced, and I found myself spending more time texting Garrett and Owen about plans for the upcoming weekend. And when Owen sent a message to the group chat announcing a party at his house on Friday night, I responded immediately with enthusiasm. And I noticed that Max did not reply right away. And when he finally did, his response was brief and non-committal. And I wondered if he was planning to find an excuse not to go because he knew that Garrett would be there and that I would be in my element surrounded by friends who appreciated my sense of humor and spontaneity. On Friday evening, Max and I drove separately to Owen's house because I had left work later than planned and did not want to wait for Max to finish up a call he was taking in the apartment. And when I arrived at Owen's place in the suburban neighborhood, where he had recently bought a modest 2-story house with a large backyard, the party was already in full swing, with at least 30 people scattered between the living room, the kitchen, and the outdoor patio area where a fire pit was glowing against the cooling autumn air. I walked through the front door carrying a bottle of wine and immediately felt the energy shift inside me from the tense, quiet atmosphere of the past week to something lighter and more exciting, and I moved through the crowded living room greeting friends and accepting compliments on my outfit, and I poured myself a generous glass of wine from the bottles lined up on the kitchen counter, and within 20 minutes I had already finished that glass and poured another because the alcohol made everything feel easier and more fun, and I felt like the version of myself that I wanted to be rather than the version that had been walking on eggshells around Max for days. Max arrived about 30 minutes after I did, and I watched from across the living room as he entered quietly and greeted Owen with a handshake and a brief exchange that I could not hear over the music. And he looked around the room until he found me standing near the kitchen, talking to Garrett and a few other people from our extended friend group. And when our eyes met, I raised my glass in a casual greeting, but did not move toward him because I was enjoying the conversation and did not want to interrupt the flow by having to navigate the tension that seemed to follow us everywhere lately. Garrett was in the middle of telling a story about a disastrous client meeting that had everyone laughing, and I leaned closer to hear him over the noise, and I noticed that he smelled like cologne and beer. And there was something easy and uncomplicated about being around him that made me feel relaxed in a way I had not felt around Max in weeks. And when Garrett made a joke at his own expense, I touched his arm and laughed louder than I probably needed to, and I caught Max watching us from where he stood near the fireplace talking to Owen. And his expression was unreadable, but I could feel the weight of his attention even from across the room. As the evening progressed and I continued drinking, the boundaries that usually kept my behavior in check started to feel less important, and I found myself moving through the party with Garrett in a way that felt natural and spontaneous, and we took a series of selfies near the backyard fire pit that I posted to my Instagram story with a caption about finally having a fun Friday night. And I tagged Garrett in the post without thinking about how it might look to anyone who was paying attention to the subtext. When we came back inside, someone suggested doing shots, and I agreed enthusiastically even though I knew I was already past the point of making good decisions. And Garrett and I stood at the kitchen counter laughing as we toasted to nothing in particular, and the room felt warm and loud and full of the kind of energy that I had been craving. And I turned to Garrett and said something about how some people just know how to have fun, while others need everything to be boring and controlled. And Garrett laughed, but his expression was slightly uncomfortable, as if he knew I was talking about Max, but did not want to be dragged into whatever tension existed between us. At some point after midnight, when the party had thinned out slightly, but was still crowded enough that no one was paying close attention to individual movements, I grabbed Garrett's hand and announced loudly to the people standing nearby that we were going to find the good snacks that Owen always hides upstairs, and someone made a joke about what we were really going to do up there, and I responded with an exaggerated wink and said we were going to find some actual fun. And I pulled Garrett toward the staircase where a beer-stained carpet runner led up to the second floor. Garrett followed me, but he hesitated at the bottom of the stairs and asked if this was a good idea, and I told him to stop being boring like Max and to just come with me, and the alcohol made me feel bold and reckless in a way that drowned out the small voice in my head, warning me that this was crossing a line, and we climbed the stairs together with my hand still holding his, and when we reached the upstairs hallway where a motion sensor light flickered on automatically, I turned to face him and stepped closer than I needed to. And I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, but also something else that looked like curiosity or possibility, and I leaned against the wall near the guest room door and pulled him toward me by the front of his shirt. And he put his hands on my waist, and I was laughing about something I cannot even remember now when I heard Max say my name from the other end of the hallway. The sound of his voice cut through the alcohol haze like cold water, and I turned my head to see Max standing at the top of the stairs where the motion sensor had just registered his arrival, and the expression on his face was not anger or jealousy, but something worse, something that looked like resignation and quiet devastation. And Garrett immediately stepped back and stammered that it was just a joke and that nothing was happening. But Max did not respond to him at all. And instead he looked at me for a long moment with an expression I had never seen before, and then he turned and walked back down the stairs without saying another word. I called after him and hurried down the stairs, trying to explain that it was just a stupid prank and that he was overreacting and making a scene, but by the time I reached the living room, Max was already walking out the front door without his coat, and Owen was standing near the entryway, watching with an uncomfortable expression. And the room had gone quiet except for the music still playing in the background, and I could feel everyone staring at me as I stood there alone near the door, realizing that something had just broken in a way I had not intended and did not know how to fix. The morning after the party, I woke up in my old apartment that I still technically shared with Bree because I had taken a rideshare home from Owen's house after Max left, and I did not want to go back to his place while I was still angry and confused about why he had made such a dramatic exit over what was clearly just a harmless joke between friends. My head was pounding from too much wine and too little sleep, and when I checked my phone, I saw that I had several missed calls from Max and a few text messages from Garrett apologizing for what had happened and saying that he felt terrible about the whole situation. And there was also a message from Owen asking if I was okay and suggesting that maybe we should all talk when everyone had calmed down. But I ignored Owen's message because I did not want to be lectured about my behaviour by someone who had no right to judge how I chose to have fun at a party. I opened the group chat that included most of our mutual friends, and I posted a long message explaining that Max had completely overreacted to a stupid prank at the party and had stormed out without even giving me a chance to explain. And I framed the incident as an example of his controlling behaviour and his inability to trust me. And I said that I was hurt and confused by his extreme reaction to something that was clearly harmless. And I suggested that maybe he needed to work on his jealousy issues before they destroyed our relationship completely. Several friends responded with supportive messages, saying that relationships require trust and that Max should not have made a scene, and a few people sent private messages asking if I was okay and offering to talk if I needed to vent. But I noticed that Owen did not respond at all, and neither did Nina, who was also in the group chat even though she was not at the party. And Bree's response was brief and non-committal, saying only that she hoped we could work things out. The lack of universal support bothered me more than I wanted to admit, because I had expected everyone to immediately take my side and validate my version of events. And the silence from certain people felt like a judgment that I was not ready to accept. And when Nina finally did post a message, it was a single sentence that said there was more to the story than what people were hearing. And her comment created an uncomfortable shift in the conversation that made me feel like the narrative was slipping out of my control. I decided that the best way to regain control was to go directly to Bree and explain everything in person. So I texted her, asking if I could come over to talk, and she replied saying that she was home, but that she only had about an hour before she needed to leave for a family commitment. And her response felt colder than usual, as if she was already distancing herself from me before even hearing my side of the story. When I arrived at Bree's apartment and knocked on the door, she opened it but stood in the doorway rather than inviting me in immediately. And there was something in her posture that made me realize this conversation was not going to go the way I had hoped. And when I asked if I could come in, she stepped aside but did not offer me coffee or sit down on the sofa the way she normally would. And instead, she leaned against the kitchen counter with her arms crossed and asked me to tell her exactly what had happened at the party, because she had heard multiple versions and wanted to understand the full situation. I explained that Garrett and I had gone upstairs as a joke and that Max had walked in at exactly the wrong moment and misinterpreted what was happening, and I emphasized that nothing inappropriate had actually occurred and that Max's reaction was completely disproportionate to the situation. But Bree interrupted me and asked why I had been tagging Garrett in social media posts about my relationship problems, and why I had been coordinating with him about attending the party, and why several people at the party had commented that I seemed to be flirting with him throughout the evening. Her questions caught me off guard because they suggested that she had been paying attention to details I thought no one else had noticed. And I told her that she was reading too much into casual social media behavior and that her willingness to believe the worst about me showed that she was not really my friend. And Bree looked at me with an expression that was both sad and frustrated. And she said quietly that she had been my friend for years, but that she was starting to see a pattern in how I treated the people who cared about me. And that maybe the problem was not that Max was controlling, but that I refused to take responsibility for how my actions affected other people. Her words stung more than I expected, and I felt tears forming in my eyes. But before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a notification from the group chat, and when I looked at the screen, I saw that Nina had posted a screenshot of a social media post I had made weeks earlier where I had complained about Max being boring and had tagged Garrett with a fire emoji, and someone in the chat had replied asking why I had been tagging Garrett in posts about my boyfriend, and the conversation had shifted in a direction that made me look manipulative and calculating rather than spontaneous and fun. I tried to defend myself by saying that people post whatever they want on their own social media and that reading into tags and emojis was ridiculous, but the damage was already done, and I could see that the narrative was no longer under my control. And when I looked back at Bree, she was watching me with an expression that told me she had already made up her mind about whose side she was on, and it was not mine. Later that afternoon, I received a phone call from my mother, Lydia, who had somehow heard about the situation through the social network of parents who stay connected through their children's drama. And she asked me what had happened with Max and whether I had done something to upset him. And her tone suggested that she had already decided I was at fault even before hearing my explanation. I told her that Max had overreacted to a harmless joke and that he was being controlling and unreasonable, and I expected her to offer the unconditional maternal support that mothers are supposed to provide, but instead she sighed and said that Max had always seemed like a good man who treated me well, and that maybe I should think carefully about whether I was throwing away something valuable over my need to prove a point. And her lack of support felt like a betrayal that compounded all the other betrayals I had experienced that day. And I ended the call abruptly and sat alone in my apartment staring at my phone and wondering how everything had gone wrong so quickly when all I had wanted was to have fun and prove that I was not the kind of person who could be controlled or diminished by someone else's insecurity. By the middle of the following week, I had sent Max several long text messages trying to explain that the party incident was a misunderstanding and that he was being unfair by refusing to talk to me. But his responses were brief and purely logistical, asking me to coordinate with the building manager about retrieving my belongings from his apartment and informing me that he had changed the locks and that I would need to schedule a time to pick up my things when he was not there. The coldness of his messages was more painful than any argument would have been, because it suggested that he had already emotionally detached from me and was treating our 3-year relationship like a business transaction that needed to be closed out efficiently. And when I tried calling him to force an actual conversation, he answered once and said calmly that there was nothing left to discuss and that he would handle the logistics through proper channels, and before I could argue, he ended the call and sent me the building manager's contact information via text. On Saturday afternoon, I saw an Instagram story that Owen had posted showing a group of people gathered in his living room, and I immediately recognized Nina and Bree in the background. And I realized with a sinking feeling that they were having a meeting about me without including me. And the deliberate exclusion felt like a public declaration that I had been cut out of the social circle I had considered my primary support network. I sent Owen a text demanding to know what was going on and why I had been excluded from a conversation that was clearly about my relationship. And he replied after a long delay, saying that Max had asked to meet with a few people who had witnessed or been affected by recent events, and that it was not personal, but that they needed to discuss things honestly without the conversation devolving into accusations and defensiveness. And his response made it clear that he believed I would be unable to participate in a calm and rational discussion, which felt like an insult on top of the betrayal of being deliberately left out. I decided that if they were going to talk about me behind my back, I had every right to show up and defend myself. So I drove to Owen's house without announcing my arrival, and when I walked through the front door without knocking, the conversation in the living room stopped abruptly, and I saw Max sitting on the sofa with a folder of papers in front of him on the coffee table, and Nina was sitting in the armchair to his right, and Bree was on the other end of the sofa, and Garrett was standing near the window, looking uncomfortable, and Owen was in the middle of saying something when I entered, and the room went silent as everyone turned to look at me. I demanded to know why they were having a secret meeting about my life without giving me a chance to be heard, and I said that it was completely unfair and manipulative to coordinate against me like this, and that whatever Max had told them was only one side of a complicated situation. But before I could continue, Max gestured calmly to the folder on the coffee table and said that I was welcome to look through the evidence he had compiled, and that nothing in it was a secret or a distortion, and that everyone in the room had already reviewed the materials and had their own observations to add. I looked at the folder and saw printed screenshots of social media posts where I had tagged Garrett and complained about Max, and there were entries from the building security log showing that Garrett had accessed Max's apartment on days when neither of us was home, and there were text message exchanges where I had coordinated attending the party with Garrett, and there was even a printed copy of the public Facebook post I had made accusing Max of being emotionally abusive, which I had deleted after a few hours, but which Nina had apparently screenshot before it disappeared. The evidence was laid out chronologically with dates and timestamps, and seeing it all together in one place made it look more damning than I had expected, because the pattern was undeniable when presented as a timeline rather than as isolated incidents that I had been able to explain away individually. And I felt my face flush with a combination of embarrassment and anger as I realized that Max had been quietly documenting everything for weeks while I had assumed he was just being passive and avoidant. Garrett spoke first and said that he needed to apologize to Max for going along with the situation at the party, and he admitted that I had been flirting with him for weeks before that night, and that he had felt uncomfortable but had not known how to shut it down without causing drama. And he said that when I pulled him upstairs, he knew it was wrong, but he had been drinking and had made a terrible decision, and his confession made me look calculating and predatory rather than spontaneous and fun. And I tried to interrupt to say that he was mischaracterizing our friendship, but Nina cut me off and said that Max did not need to hear my version because he had already lived through it and had given me multiple opportunities to be honest, and that this meeting was not about convincing me of anything, but about making sure everyone understood the facts so they could make informed decisions about their own boundaries. Bree added quietly that she could not support my version of events anymore because the evidence contradicted the story I had been telling, and she said that she had seen this pattern before with my previous relationships, where I would push boundaries and then frame the other person as controlling when they objected. And her words felt like a betrayal because I had expected her loyalty regardless of the circumstances, and I looked around the room and realized that I had lost them all, not through some coordinated conspiracy, but simply because they had compared notes and discovered that my narrative did not match reality. And Max sat quietly through all of it with an expression that was neither angry nor triumphant, but simply tired. And when I tried one last time to defend myself, he said calmly that he was done with explanations and that he would be handling things through proper channels moving forward. And the finality in his voice made it clear that there was no path back to what we had been, and that the relationship was over in every sense that mattered. 2 weeks after the intervention at Owen's house, I received an email from Max's apartment building management informing me that a no trespass order had been filed and that any attempt to enter the property without authorization would result in police involvement. And the email included a reference number and instructions for scheduling the pickup of my remaining belongings through a supervised process with building security present. I ignored the order because I believed it was an overreaction, and because I convinced myself that if I could just talk to Max in person one more time, I could make him understand that everything had been blown out of proportion. And so, on a Thursday afternoon, I drove to his workplace hoping to catch him in the parking garage during his lunch break. But when I approached his car, a co-worker saw the interaction, and Max immediately called building security, and the incident was documented with a witness statement that I did not realize would become part of a legal filing until several days later. On a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the party, I went to the downtown courthouse to handle a traffic ticket from a speeding violation I had received months earlier. And as I was walking through the lobby, past the security checkpoint with my phone in one hand and my purse over my shoulder, a man in a dark suit approached me near the information desk and asked if I was Thalia Morvan, And when I confirmed my identity, he handed me a manila envelope and explained that I was being served with a temporary restraining order filed by Maxwell Caldwell. I tried to refuse the papers and demanded to speak to Max directly, but the process server said calmly that service was complete and that the order was effective immediately, and that any contact with Max would result in law enforcement involvement, and I stood there in the courthouse lobby holding the envelope while people moved around me on their way to hearings and appointments, and I saw two acquaintances from our extended social circle standing near the elevator bank watching the exchange, and I knew that by the end of the day, everyone would know what had happened.